Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
It started with one of those jokes that's meant to be harmless. Half a grin, a pat on the back, and just enough sugarcoating to pretend it wasn't meant to hurt. We were halfway through family game night, the table cluttered with Scrabble tiles, half-empty beer bottles, and the remains of my aunt's seven-layer dip, when Uncle Dale leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head, like he was about to deliver the punchline of the decade. "Maybe if you settled down, you'd be invited more often," he said, just loud enough for the whole table to hear, just smug enough to get a few nervous chuckles from the cousins. Now, you have to understand something about Dale. He's the kind of man who thinks sarcasm makes him clever and being old school is some kind of badge of honor. The last time I saw him was 3 years ago, and even then, he managed to squeeze in a snide remark about my independent lifestyle, as he calls it. Like being a single woman with her own income is some tragic deviation from the American dream. That night, though, I didn't flinch. I didn't let the heat rise to my face or bite my tongue like I used to. Instead, I smiled, tilted my head, and said, I was busy signing deeds for my third property. The room went quiet. Dead, you could say. There wasn't a single sound, not even the fake kind of laugh people make when they're trying to smooth things over. Just the clink of Aunt Barb's spoon against the casserole dish and the way everyone suddenly found something to look at on their plates. I didn't look at Dale after I said it. I looked at my mother, whose smile had frozen mid-expression, like she was trying to figure out if I just embarrassed the family or made a power move. Probably both. I hadn't planned to say it. Hell, I hadn't even planned to show up that night. But guilt does strange things to a person, especially when it's your mother calling, voice trembling just enough to make you feel like not coming would mean missing something irreversible. Just come for an hour, she said. Your cousins haven't seen you in years. That part was true. I hadn't been home for any of the holidays, hadn't sent birthday cards, hadn't replied to Facebook event invites. It wasn't because I didn't care. I just got tired of pretending I fit in. Every time I came back, it felt like walking into a play where everyone had memorized their lines except me, my siblings with their spouses and their matching outfits, and their PTA stories. My dad retelling the same 4 jokes about his glory days in college. My mom fluttering around trying to make everything look perfect, while quietly judging the way I never offered to help set the table. And then there was me, Rachel McBride, the oddball, the lone wolf, the one who left home at 22, and never really looked back, except in rearview mirrors, or late-night wine-soaked regrets. And now, here I was, 38 years old, sitting at the same table I'd run away from, watching my family try to act like I'd never left. Dale's joke cracked that illusion wide open, and for once, I didn't feel like patching it up. I felt like letting the cracks show. Nobody really said anything after my comeback. My cousin Jenny looked like she wanted to high-five me but was too scared her mom would scold her for encouraging rebellion. My brother Kevin gave me that half-laugh, half-smirk that meant, nice one, but you're still making things awkward. My mom asked if anyone wanted more dip. Nobody did. And that should have been the end of it, a weird moment, some awkward silence, and then back to pretending we're all one big happy family. But something happened as I went to grab a soda from the fridge. I passed the hallway near the kitchen, and I heard my cousin Matt whispering to someone. Maybe Jenny or Kevin, I'm not sure who exactly. What I heard was, she'll never go for it if we push too soon. Wait till after dessert. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe for a second. I just stood there, can of Sprite in my hand, heart pounding so loud I swear it was drowning out every other sound in the house. It wasn't just a comment. It wasn't just some vague family gossip. It was a plan, one that I wasn't supposed to know about. And in that moment, the whole night made sense in a way that made my stomach twist. The warm welcome, the smiles that didn't reach their eyes, the way they kept hinting at how grown-up and responsible I'd become. It wasn't about reconnecting. It wasn't about family. It was about something they wanted, something they needed. And whatever it was, they were waiting for just the right moment to spring it on me. So I went back to the table, cracked open my soda like nothing had happened, smiled a little too wide, and waited. I've been underestimated my whole life. Too quiet, too distant, too different. But if there's one thing I've learned from signing deals and managing tenants and surviving in a world that doesn't give single women many second chances, it's this: I know how to play a long game better than most. And whatever they were planning, they weren't ready for me to play back. The day after game night felt like the silence after a fire alarm finally shuts off. Your ears are still ringing, your body still tense, and yet all you can do is sit in the quiet and try to convince yourself that nothing's burning anymore. I woke up the next morning in my old room, or at least what used to be my room before it was slowly converted into a half-hearted storage space. The floral wallpaper I once begged to keep had faded to a tired yellow. Boxes labeled Christmas decor, garage sale maybe, and one mysterious Kevin's stuff, do not touch, had replaced my old bookshelves and posters. There was a hollowness in that room, not just from the clutter, but from the fact that nothing of me really remained there, not even in the things that once belonged to me. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee my mother had placed outside my door like I was a guest in her Airbnb, and I tried to replay last night with a cooler head. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the thing I overheard wasn't even about me. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized I wasn't imagining it, and the more it started to make sense. My family didn't invite me out of nostalgia or guilt or some renewed desire to mend what had fractured years ago. They brought me back because I had something they wanted, and whatever it was, they decided the best way to ask was through the soft manipulation of shared memories and home-cooked casseroles. By the time I made it downstairs, everyone had already finished breakfast. The kitchen smelled like bacon grease and old coffee, and the only person still sitting at the table was my dad, leafing through the sports section like it was 1982 and smartphones didn't exist. He barely looked up when I walked in, just muttered something that sounded like mourning and went back to reading about whatever the Cubs had failed to do again. I poured myself some coffee, stronger than the one my mom left at my door, and waited for someone to say something, anything. But they didn't. Not until my brother Kevin walked in and said the one thing I'd been expecting and dreading all morning. "Hey, can we talk for a sec?" He didn't wait for me to answer, just jerked his head toward the porch and walked off like I was some employee he needed to give a performance review. I followed mug in hand, pretending not to feel the knot tightening in my stomach. We sat on the porch swing, just the two of us, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know last night was weird," he began, rubbing his hands together like he was about to sell me something I didn't want. "And I know Dale's a pain in the ass sometimes, but we really were glad you came." I let that hang in the air for a moment, just long enough to make it clear I didn't believe a word of it. He cleared his throat, looked out at the empty street, and then dropped the pretense. "So here's the thing," he said. "Claire and we're trying to buy this new place. Bigger yard, closer to the school, better neighborhood. It's a stretch, but it could be great for the kids." There it was, the ask, the hook wrapped in family obligation. "And," I said, not offering anything more, "well, the bank's being picky. They're looking at our credit history, and you know how stuff is after the layoff and, the whole truck situation. Anyway, long story short, if we had a cosigner, someone stable, someone with, great financials, this thing could go through next week." He didn't say it directly. He didn't have to. The implication was thick in the air between us. He wanted me to co-sign on a house I would never live in, never benefit from, never even be thanked for. I sipped my coffee, watching the steam rise like a smoke signal, and tried to figure out whether I felt more angry or insulted. Maybe both, but mostly I felt tired. "And why me?" I finally asked, though I already knew. Kevin laughed softly, almost sheepishly, like he'd been expecting that question. "Because you're the only one who can," he said. "You've always been the responsible one, Rachel, even when we were kids." I nearly choked on my coffee. That was rich coming from the same man who, at 19, stole my debit card to buy concert tickets and then cried when I threatened to call the cops. The same man whose idea of a retirement plan was scratching lottery tickets and sharing memes about Bitcoin on Facebook. Still, I didn't say no. Not yet. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that old need to not be the villain, the one they could all whisper about when I left. Or maybe I wanted to see just how far they were willing to go. So I smiled, not the kind of smile you give out of kindness, but the kind you wear like armor, and said, "Let me think about it." His shoulders dropped with relief, and in that moment, I realized just how sure he'd been that I'd cave, that I'd come back and fall into line, like I always used to, before I learned how to say no. And something about that made my blood simmer. I went back inside, past my mother, who offered me a fresh slice of pie, like I was 5 years old again, and I nodded politely, declining the offer. She gave me that tight-lipped smile she always wore when she was disappointed but didn't want to say it out loud. I climbed the stairs slowly, not because I was tired, but because I needed a moment to figure out what I was feeling. It wasn't just betrayal. It was betrayal wrapped in sentimentality, sealed with a kiss and a slice of lemon meringue. They hadn't invited me back out of love. They'd invited me back because they thought I could be used. And for the first time in years, I realized I had the upper hand, and I planned to use it. The mind has this cruel way of storing pain in dusty corners, only to drag it out when you least expect it. Like a box of old junk you forgot was shoved behind your couch until you move it and find something that ruins your whole day. That was exactly what happened to me the next morning, as I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring into a yard I once knew like the back of my hand. The swing set was still there, rusted at the joints, paint peeling like sunburnt skin, and it made me think of the days when Kevin and I used to fight over who could swing higher. Back then, I thought we were just two kids trying to touch the sky. I didn't realize we were already learning to push each other out of the way to get there first. What Kevin had asked me the day before, no, not asked, positioned like a reasonable favor wrapped in family language, shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Not because I thought he'd changed, but because a part of me had secretly hoped that maybe I was wrong about all of them, that maybe time and distance could have softened them, maybe even taught them to treat me like a person instead of a resource. But hearing those words, "You're the only one who can," just reminded me that in their eyes, I wasn't a sister or a daughter. I was a walking credit score. The tea tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, because sometimes you have to swallow the bad to remember why you stopped coming around in the first place. And as I sat there, wrapped in the kind of silence that only truly lives in childhood homes, where the creak of the floorboards means more than words ever could, I thought back to the last time Kevin had needed my help. I was 22, fresh out of college, still unsure of who I was or what I wanted, but certain that family meant something. He'd come to me with this look on his face, the kind of look that manipulates people without ever needing to say a word. He told me he was in trouble, that he just needed a little help getting through a rough patch, and that he'd pay me back the moment he could. I gave him my trust, my savings account, and a piece of my pride. And what did he give me? Lies, excuses, silence. When I asked for the money back, he said I was selfish for demanding it when I could clearly see he was struggling. When I told my parents, they acted like I was making a big deal out of nothing, like I was some cold-hearted monster for expecting accountability. "He's your brother," they said, as if blood were the same as justice. "You've always been the strong one," my mother told me, as though strength was a punishment handed out to those who didn't crumble. That memory returned like an old wound someone had poked too hard, and as it opened, so did every moment I had locked away, every time I had been told to let it go, every instance where I'd been guilted into silence, and every Sunday dinner I skipped because I couldn't bear to sit at a table where love came with conditions. I was still deep in thought when the sliding door creaked open, and I heard the hesitant steps of someone who didn't want to be caught eavesdropping. It was my niece Tessa, Kevin's oldest, 14 going on 40, with that disinterested shrug always plastered across her face like the world had let her down early. She stood there awkwardly, fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie, before finally blurting out, "Dad said you're rich." I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the suddenness of it, and replied, "Did he?" "Yeah," she said, shifting from foot to foot. "He said you have, houses, plural." I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "That's true. There was a pause. She didn't sit down, didn't get comfortable, just looked at me like she was waiting for a specific line of dialogue to come out of my mouth. When I didn't offer it, she added, "He also said you don't help family, that you left everyone behind." The words hit harder than they should have, not because they were true, but because they were being repeated by a kid who didn't know better, a kid who had been fed a version of me shaped by her parents' resentment and jealousy. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw myself at that age. Confused, alone in a crowd of people who said they loved me, but only when I did what they wanted. "Well," I said after a long pause, "people tell stories when they don't want to admit the truth." She didn't ask what truth I meant, and I didn't offer. There are some things you don't explain to kids, even when they ask in roundabout ways. But I could see it in her face. She was piecing things together. Maybe not all at once, but the seeds were there. After she went back inside, I sat still for a long time, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful but focused, like the moment before pulling a trigger or signing a contract. I could have said no to Kevin that day. I could have walked away and left them to figure it out. But something about that moment with Tessa, something about seeing my story being rewritten in real time to turn me into the villain, ignited something in me. I wasn't going to say no. I was going to say yes, but not the kind of yes they expected. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it's quiet, almost polite. Sometimes it walks into the trap you've set, smiling. And I was going to give them the smile they were waiting for. By the time I sent the message asking Kevin and Claire to meet me at my place to go over the mortgage paperwork, I had already decided that if I was going to play the role they wrote for me, the wealthy, childless sister whose success made her the family's emergency ATM, then I was going to play it so well it would shake every one of them to their core, not with volume or anger or dramatic confrontation, but with the cold, calculated precision of someone who'd been underestimated her whole life and was finally done pretending not to notice. The message I sent was short, polite, warm even, the kind of tone you use when you're about to lower the hammer, but still want them to think they're in control. "I've looked over the numbers, and I think we should talk. Come by Wednesday after work if you have time." I cleaned the house before they came. Not because I cared what they thought, but because there was something oddly satisfying about inviting them into a space I built entirely on my own. A house they hadn't seen and would never be welcome in again after this meeting. Everything was spotless, from the granite countertops to the hardwood floors I'd had redone just 6 months ago, and as I laid out the paperwork neatly on the kitchen table, I made sure the view of the backyard, with its manicured lawn and tasteful stone fountain, was unobstructed. It wasn't just about showing them the life I had built. It was about making them realize that I had done it without them, and more importantly, that I had no intention of ever letting them take it from me. They arrived exactly on time, Claire holding a reusable grocery bag for some reason, probably filled with snacks, as if that would somehow make the moment more casual, more family. Kevin looked tired, not from work, but from the weight of expectations he'd spent his life ducking and now hoped to dump squarely onto me. I welcomed them with the same smile I'd used in boardrooms and real estate closings. The one that says, "I know exactly what's happening, but I'm letting you speak first, out of courtesy." They sat, and I slid the stack of papers across the table. "I had a lawyer friend of mine draft something that would protect both of us," I said, feigning nonchalance. "It's just a standard co-sign agreement, with a few extra lines to ensure that if anything goes wrong, I'm not left holding the entire mess." I watched them nod along, Claire squinting at the text like it was written in a foreign language, Kevin pretending to read but clearly not absorbing a single word. That's when I leaned forward and pointed at a specific clause halfway down the page, written in plain English but small enough to be overlooked by anyone rushing to get what they want. "This just says that if the mortgage goes into default, I assume full ownership of the property. It's just a safety net, nothing to worry about if all goes well." Claire looked up, her lips parting slightly. "Wait, you'd get the house?" "Only if you stop paying," I replied smoothly. It's standard in a lot of investor-backed contracts. Keeps everyone honest. The look on Kevin's face shifted. Not quite panic, but discomfort so tangible you could smell it. He picked up the paper again, reading the paragraph now, as if it were an accusation. That's not how this usually works, right? I wouldn't know, I said, folding my hands calmly. I've only ever been on the side that pays the bills. The silence stretched for a moment too long, and then, as if on cue, Tessa, who Claire had dragged along without even asking, wandered into the room, holding her phone and clearly bored out of her mind. "What's this?" she asked, leaning over the table. Kevin tried to wave her away, but it was too late. She had already skimmed the key sentence, and in the clear, unaffected tone of a teenager with no filter, she read aloud. If borrower fails to meet mortgage obligations, cosigner assumes sole property ownership. What does that mean? Kevin looked like he'd been slapped. Claire turned red, muttering something about how this wasn't appropriate. But I just sat there, smiling, letting the moment unravel exactly the way I planned. It means, I said quietly, that I'm not being taken for a ride this time. If I'm expected to carry the risk, I'll also carry the reward. You've got to be kidding, Kevin snapped, standing now, his voice rising with that old mix of guilt and entitlement that used to scare me when I was younger, but now just sounded pitiful. You're using this to get something out of us? That's disgusting. No, I said, standing slowly, carefully, like someone who knows the exact weight of their own presence. What's disgusting is expecting someone to risk their financial future for you without even reading the contract. My mother had told me once, during one of our last phone calls before I stopped answering, that I would regret being so hard, that one day I'd look back and wish I'd softened. But standing there, watching Kevin and Claire stumble over their own expectations like kids caught cheating on a test, I felt nothing but clarity. I wasn't the hard one. I was the only one who had learned. Claire tried to salvage the moment with some pitiful gesture, offering to talk more about it later or maybe work out a version that feels fair to everyone. But I just shook my head. There is no version, I said. This is the deal. You sign it or you don't. But if you don't ever come to me asking again. Kevin's jaw clenched, and then, as if to drive home just how deep the rot went, he muttered, "This is why you're alone, Rachel. You don't know how to love anyone but yourself." I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. I simply walked to the door, opened it, and stood aside. You can see yourselves out. And as they left, grumbling, muttering, their little performance unraveling under the weight of their own entitlement, I felt something settle in me, not peace exactly, but a kind of firm, steady satisfaction. Because for the first time in my life, I hadn't just walked away from a trap, I'd sprung it myself, and I hadn't raised my voice once. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in once the storm passes, a hollow, vibrating stillness that doesn't feel like peace, but more like the sound of your own breath, filling the gaps left by everything and everyone you just let go of. After Kevin and Claire stormed out of my house, faces flushed with the kind of humiliation that only comes when someone realizes they were outplayed by the person they assumed would always fold, I stood in the entryway for a long while, hands still on the doorknob, eyes fixed on the space they had just occupied, almost waiting to feel some kind of sorrow or ache or maybe even regret for how coldly I had handled it. But none of that came. What came instead was the slow rising realization that the silence I was left with wasn't emptiness at all. It was relief. It was space. It was finally mine. The hours after they left passed like molasses, thick and quiet, the late sunlight casting long golden bars across the hardwood floor, while the house seemed to exhale all the tension that had briefly invaded it. I poured myself a glass of wine, not out of celebration, but out of habit, and sat on the back deck with it in hand, staring out over the yard that, unlike the people I shared blood with, had never lied to me, never demanded anything I wasn't willing to give. There were no calls from my mother, no texts from my father, no passive-aggressive group messages trying to smooth over what had happened. And the absence of all that confirmed what I already knew deep in my bones. I had crossed a line that they never expected me to cross, not because it was cruel or unfair, but because it meant I had finally, undeniably, chosen myself. In the days that followed, the silence remained, but it didn't feel like punishment, it felt like permission. I went back to my routines, back to managing my properties, signing leases, checking on repairs, and talking to tenants who, despite their flaws, had never expected me to mortgage my soul in exchange for basic respect. I passed by family photos still tucked away in drawers, saw familiar faces in forgotten frames, and I realized that nostalgia, while intoxicating, is often nothing more than the selective memory of pain edited by longing. Every time I felt the flicker of guilt trying to sneak in, I reminded myself that love, if it only functions when you're compliant, isn't love at all, it's control, dressed in sentimentality. 1 week later, I drove 2 hours north to a quiet suburb where a small single-story house sat on a tree-lined street. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it was clean, modern, and efficient. Exactly the kind of property I like to invest in. But this time, I wasn't there to invest. I signed the papers myself, cash, no contingencies, and this time, the deed was only in my name. It wasn't for a tenant. It wasn't for a flip. It was for me. Because after a lifetime of trying to prove my worth by building things for other people, degrees, careers, favors, bridges back to families that kept burning them, I wanted something that no one could take or question or leverage against me. I wanted stillness that didn't demand silence. I wanted freedom that didn't ask for forgiveness. I moved in that same weekend with nothing but the essentials. No heavy furniture, no memory-laced heirlooms. Just a few good books, my laptop, my coffee machine, and a framed quote that had followed me through every apartment, every office, every temporary space I'd ever called mine. Family isn't blood, it's who doesn't make you bleed. I placed it on the mantel, directly across from the couch, where it would sit like a quiet truth staring down every fear I'd ever had about being alone. There were moments, of course, where the weight of it all sat heavy on my chest, moments when the silence stretched too long, when holidays approached without invitation, when I saw friends posting pictures with their brothers and sisters, their nieces and nephews, all tangled in smiles and matching sweaters. And in those moments, I would ask myself, not out of doubt, but out of honest curiosity, was I really free? Or had I simply walked away before they could push me again? Was solitude strength? Or just a softer name for loneliness? But the more I sat with those questions, the more I understood that the answers didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that I was finally the one asking them, not being told how to feel, not being guilted into a mold that never fit. Because freedom, I realized, isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of fear, of manipulation, of that quiet, constant negotiation of self that happens when you're trying to make others feel comfortable with your existence. A month passed before I got a message, not from Kevin, not from Claire, not even from my parents. It was from Tessa, just a short text. No punctuation, no preamble, just 6 words. I know why you said no. I stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the screen, and then I simply typed back, "One day you'll have to too." She didn't reply, and I didn't need her to, because some stories don't end with reconciliations or apologies. Some stories end with the hero walking away. Not triumphant, not vindicated. Just honest, just real, just finally done pretending that survival is the same as love. And maybe that's not the ending they'll tell at the next family game night. Maybe they'll paint me as the villain, the cold sister, the arrogant one who chose herself over unity. Maybe they'll say I lost touch, forgot where I came from, turned my back on everything that mattered. But I'll be here, in my quiet house, surrounded by things I earned, peace I built, and silence I own. And for once, I won't care how the story ends, because I'm the one who finally wrote it.